And again, welcome and thank you for coming this afternoon. We're very excited, or have been very excited, about this Vatican II project. My name is Eileen Burke-Sullivan. I have the privilege of being the Vice Provost for Mission and Ministry here at Creighton, and I'm also the holder of the Barbara Reardon-Haney Chair in Pastoral Liturgical Theology. And a number of years ago, or now it's a number of years ago, it seems like yesterday, when I was appointed to the chair, one of the things that became very clear to me was that the anniversary, the 50th anniversary of the Second Vatican Council was soon upon us. The council was between 1962 and 1965, so that was 2012 to 2015 would be the golden anniversary of this incredible worldwide meeting of the Catholic Church, at which a number of observers were invited from other Christian denominations, and during which very significant conversations took place about the Catholic Church's relationship to other world religions. Throughout the years of the Council, the project of meeting and developing ways of interfacing with the world, it grew, it developed in the bishops as they met, as these leaders of the church met in Rome every fall from September to December for those 4 years. And in the final year, several very important documents, the year 1965, which is just 50 years ago now, in the final term in the fall, some of the most contentious but most important documents were finalized and published. One of those is the document that we're honoring today, Nostra Aetate, which was a short document. Of all the Vatican II documents, of the 16 documents, this is one of the shortest. And the document was originally intended to be a chapter or two in another document on the church that eventually spawned 3 other documents than itself. So the original text was not anywhere close to this. But we recall at this period that the church and the world was coming out of the Second World War, shortly after the Korean War, and during the 60s, when there was an enormous amount of discussion and dialogue and conflict around any number of human rights and human relationship issues, not least of which were interreligious and interracial and so forth. So as we reflect back on the 50 years and then look forward, what difference in terms of our awareness as Catholics and our participation with Jews, with Muslims, with Hindus and Buddhists, and even with nature religions in the native populations, the Aboriginal populations of the United States, of Latin America, of Australia and New Zealand, and of course the tribal religions of Africa. All of those groups, in one way or another, the church has engaged, and it has changed any numbers of ways that we think about ourselves as Catholics, but as the way we are in relationship with the world. And I dare say we've changed how those groups of people who have engaged the dialogue have also looked at themselves. So this afternoon we have a kind of special privilege of listening initially to 2 speakers who are our own Creighton specialists. Father Dennis Hamm, our first speaker, is an emeritus professor of the theology department and is a biblical scholar of actually international repute. We're very, very proud of the multiple publications and works that Dennis has done very quietly through the years as he has taught a full load and still done brilliant scholarship and scriptural work, and has engaged dialogue with the Jewish community and has been very deeply involved and committed to social justice issues. And a number of years he was appointed the holder of the Graff Chair here on campus, which was really focused on Catholic theology, and he specialized in that in terms of Catholic social teaching. He's now emeritus of both the chair and of the theology department, but is still doing his very important research. And when I asked him if he would take time to also engage us in this conversation, Dennis very graciously said yes. So I am excited and pleased to have him joining us this afternoon, Father Dennis Hamm. He will be followed by Dr. Leonard Greenspoon, the holder of the Klutznick Chair here on campus, one of the most esteemed faculty members and scholars in his right. The Klutznick Chair is focused on Jewish scholarship, and Leonard has certainly contributed to that here and across not only this country, but Israel and most of the world. And so we're very impressed with his work as well, and I think you will really enjoy his contribution to this conversation. I certainly have enjoyed working with Leonard and with Dennis in preparing this. So I'd like to invite Dennis to come forward and give his remarks contextualizing Nostra Aetate and its effects, and then hear a response from Leonard after he's finished. Dennis?
Well, good afternoon. Thanks for coming on such a beautiful day when so many other things are competing with us.
Like what, the Duke basketball game?
Something like that. Yeah. Now, regarding the relationships between the Catholic Church and non-Christian religions of the world, especially Judaism, we've come a long way in the past half century. But that development would not have been possible without the revolution represented by the 16 documents produced by Vatican Council II 50 years ago. Today we focus on the smallest of those documents, Nostra Aetate, Latin for in our time, first words, declaration on the relation of the Catholic Church to non-Christian religions, a mere 3.5 pages. My reflection has 4 parts. First, I'll share a bit of my own nearly 80 years of experience of religious pluralism, mainly a story of near cluelessness. Second, I'll review the tortuous history of the genesis of Nostra Aetate, full of near-death episodes. Third, I'll attempt a resume of the contents of the document. And fourth, I'll venture some concluding remarks. Okay, part 1, growing up among the religions, or clueless in Milwaukee. When I was growing up in what was admittedly a Roman Catholic ghetto in Milwaukee in the late 1930s, yes, I start back there, through the 1950s, religious others were not Muslims, Hindus, or Lakota Sioux. The others were Protestants and Jews, and I encountered few of them. Buddhists, Muslims, Hindus were exotic pagans in far-off lands. When Sister in St. Robert's Grade School warned us to stay away from bad companions, the phrase in my mind meant Protestants, and I didn't know anybody Protestant, really. I knew 3 Jews, Maxine Weisfeld, who was my age and lived next door, and her parents. Her dad was Dr. Weisfeld, who became our family physician because he lived next door and we liked him, and because new in town we didn't know any other doctors. For the first 22 years of my life, the only ecumenical relations I had were with a Presbyterian family, neighbors across the back fence, who became good friends because my kid brother knew their youngest son. And the only further connection with the Jewish world occurred when my mother arranged for me to take piano lessons from Liberace's teacher. It's true. Who worked out of the Milwaukee Jewish Community Center. With her, the conversation was about Chopin and Bach, not Israel, the Torah, or food laws. Now, fast forward half a century, and how different is our sense of religious identity and diversity now. Worldwide religious diversity is present in all of our local public spaces. More likely in our workplace than in our neighborhoods, but there too, even in Nebraska, where we are seemingly more homogeneous, but where in fact we speak, they tell us, some 57 languages, many representing distinct religious orientations. Nebraska is the only U.S. state I know of in which congregations from three of the major world religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, have decided to collaborate in something called a tri-faith initiative, entailing the sharing of a common campus with the three communities are building a synagogue, a mosque, and a church, plus a common building which will house a scholarly library serving all three traditions, an environment for interreligious dialogue. It's notable that this campus is in the southwest corner of what was previously a Jewish golf course, built at a time when Jews were not welcome in the private golf clubs of Omaha. The full title of today's focus is Nostra Aetate, in our times, Declaration on the Relation of the Church to Non-Christian Religions. It's important to remember that this, the smallest of the 16 documents produced by the Council, 41 sentences, organized into 5 very short chapters, was the product of what historian John O'Malley has called the biggest meeting in the history of the world. It sounds exaggerated, but it's true. Some 2,300 middle-aged and elderly men from most of the larger cultures of the world were called together by Pope John XXIII to update the Catholic Church so that it could better live and share the gospel more effectively with the modern world. The purpose was clarification and renewal rather than defense and condemnation, which had been the usual agenda items of such councils. 2 European words were used to describe the task: aggiornamento, Italian for updating, and ressourcement, French for reconnecting with the essential tradition. Part 2, the perilous genesis of the document. Even though the document called the Declaration on the Relationship of the Church to Non-Christian Religions, that's the subtitle, the focus from the beginning and throughout the entire development over 6 years had always been the relationship of the Catholic Church to the Jews. How it grew into something much larger, for that larger horizon, is one part of a fascinating story. The God of the ancient and expanding cosmos is also the God of small things. The genesis of Nostra Aetate begins with 2 conversations between 3 men. So we begin with a movement from Isaac to Roncalli to Bea. Pope John XXIII began the process toward Vatican II by announcing his intention in January of 1959. Preparations for its opening occupied the next 3 years. And part of those preparations involved his creation of a Secretariat for Promoting Christian Unity, SBCU. Keep that in mind because I'll be referring to this little group. In June 5th of 1960, whose purpose was at first simply to help other Christians follow the work of the council. Sounds mainly like PR work. He appointed Cardinal Augustin Bea of the Society of Jesus as president and Johannes Willebrands to be the secretary. One of the 2 full-time staff persons was the recently ordained Paulist priest who grew up in my hometown parish, Father Tom Stransky, from whose reflections I learned most of this part of the story. The Secretariat also involved 15 bishop members and 20 consultors. And when you hear me refer to the Secretariat or SPCU, think of an elderly cardinal, a younger cardinal, 2 young staff persons working in shabby quarters equipped with 3 bathtubs, which they used as their low-tech filing system. At their first meeting, November of 1960, the Secretariat learned that Pope John was mandating that office to an additional task, to facilitate reflection on the Jewish question, Pope John had had a half-hour conversation with an 81-year-old French Jewish scholar by the name of Jules Isaac. He was an historian who had lost family members to Nazi gas chambers and had founded a study group in Paris comprised of Christians and Jews, Amitié Judéo-Chrétienne, who had been researching what he came to call the teaching of contempt by Christians regarding Jews. Isaac spoke with Pope John the 23rd in September of 1960 about addressing this teaching of contempt. He presented a resume of the research of the Amitié and urged that it was time for a voice from the summit to be true to the teaching of Jesus of Nazareth and show the true path. In other words, correct the teaching of contempt. And so the Pope asked Isaac to discuss the memorandum with Cardinal Bea. Father Stransky summarizes the anti-Jewish tradition long espoused in much of Christendom in the following way. God continues to punish the Jewish people for its rejection and killing of Jesus, the Son of God, Messiah, and Savior of all. By this deicide, Jews have forsaken all rights to God's promise in the Old Covenant, which has been completely replaced by the good news identified as the Catholic Church, which of course is what we have come to call supersessionism, where the church is imagined as simply replacing Judaism. Like sinful Cain, Jews should continue to wander the earth as vagabonds without a homeland. God sustains their dispersed existence to remind Catholics of the divine blessings of the New Covenant and Jews of their true calling to share the same by converting. Now, it's an awful thing to read that out loud to a group. I was never taught this tradition, either in my Catholic upbringing nor in my Jesuit formation, but the research of Isaac and many others shows that such a tradition has been alive and well for centuries as the teaching of many Christians, if not the official Christian teaching. But there it was. After consulting with Bea, Pope John gave the Secretariat a new mandate to foster a spiritual, catechetical, and theological turnabout regarding this toxic tradition. This new task proved surprisingly difficult. Not that anybody agreed that it needed to be reversed, but in the Middle East, all religious acts have political implications. For Arab states, any favorable treatment of the Jews meant a positive support for what they considered the intrusive Zionist entity, the recently constituted 1948 State of Israel. Cardinal Bea approached the so-called Jewish Pope, Nachum Goldman, the president of the World Jewish Congress and co-chair of the World Conference of Jewish Organizations, seeking a memorandum of recommendations for the SPCU and for the Council. As Goldman anticipated, such a united front from Jewish groups proved impossible. Why should a solemn council make a 180-degree turnabout in Catholic teaching about Jews? And if the church did change, would it not ask for concessions from Jews regarding their unique religious identity? The World Conference of Jewish Organizations stressed cooperation in opposing all forms of racial prejudice and religious intolerance. Well, here come the three setbacks to this whole process. In August of 1960, Cardinal Taviani and Sebastian Trump of the Society of Jesus, President and Secretary of the Theological Commission, refused to accept the SPCU's paper on the Jews, insisting that there was only one theological commission, theirs, and that the SPCU is purely pastoral. Pope, however, encourages Bea to have the SBCU prepare a presentation on ecumenism, on religious freedom, and on the Jews for the 120 members of the Coordinating Commission, a group the Pope created to expedite the progress of the Council. You thought Congress was a complex political entity? This is what was going on at this meeting. So the Pope has set up an end run around the Theological Commission by setting up this other body. Second setback. The World Jewish Council appoints Israel's counselor on Christian affairs to be an observer at the council, endorsed by Foreign Minister Golda Meir. Now, it was other Christians that were asked to be observers. So this was quite an unexpected intervention. This perhaps, excuse me, I'm just coming back from a long recovery. The second setback happened this way. The World Council, Jewish Council, appointed this minister to be an observer. And of course, this prompts vigorous protests from Arab diplomats. With Bea's support, Secretary of State Cardinal Cicognani withdraws the draft on the Jews from the council agenda. However, after the first session of the council, Bea convinces John Paul that De Judaeis, as the document was called in Latin, should be placed on the agenda for the next session of the council. Remember, there were 4 sessions all told. In a handwritten note, Pope John affirms that the mandate he had given to the Secretariat in 1960 was still in effect. After Pope John's death that summer, the newly elected Paul VI renews the mandate. The SBCU attaches its documents on religious freedom and on the Jews as concluding chapters on the Declaration on Ecumenism. The third apparent setback comprises what historians have come to call the Great Debate on the Jews in Session 3 in 1964. While the large majority of the Council Fathers supported the text, a minority coalition comprised of 3 subgroups offered 3 objections. Now listen to these. Remember, these are small groups, but they speak very strongly because of their varied experiences and context. This first subgroup was the patriarchs and bishops of the Eastern Catholic churches. They approved the text on ecumenism and religious freedom, but had serious objections regarding the chapter on the Jews, because their flocks were a minority amidst Muslim Arab majorities. They feared reprisals if they did not display opposition. Syrian Patriarch Ignatius Tapuni, in the name of the 4 Middle East patriarchs, asserted De Judaeis is totally inappropriate and should be completely abandoned from the agenda. That's just one group. Second group, some Latin American, Italian, and Spanish bishops argued that Nostra Aetate's principal tenets were against the ordinary teaching authority or magisterium of the church. So in their part of the world, that teaching of contempt, they considered part of the magisterium. Talk about a minority opinion. 3, the bishops of Asia and Africa pulled from another direction entirely. They said if the council deals with the spiritual bonds between the church and Jewish people, then it should enlarge the schema to embrace the 2/3 of the world's religious people who are neither Christian nor Jews. Finally, the council officials introduced a higher imperative. The four presidents and the coordinating commission of the council strongly urged an alternative. Insert a briefer statement on the Jews in the proposed Constitution on Divine Revelation, and insert the statement on the other religions into a chapter on the people of God in the document on the church. These moves would avoid the political interpretations that the bishops from the Middle East feared and that the Jews desired. The SBCU avoided what might have become a quiet burial of their work. Before following the suggestion of the Coordinating Commission, the Secretariat decided to try to create a fuller schema that included material from on the other world religions. So that was their end run around that suggestion of distributing and burying their work in other documents. Long story short, this fresh version of Nostra Aetate passed during the fourth session. Listen to this count. 2,312 versus 88. And you can guess where those 88 nays came from. So it was an enormous consensus, the 2,312. Well, part 3 now, the contents of the Declaration. Remember, it's in 5 short chapters that cover 3.5 pages. It takes me as long to summarize it as it is to read the original. But I've got some comments to make as I summarize, so please bear with me because this is really an important part of it. But to begin with chapter 1. Chapter 1 picks up the keynote of the title, In Our Times. In other council documents, they recognize the world in the world of the 1960s, in the wake of 2 world wars and the universal threat of nuclear weapons. It was surely time to focus on what the population of the planet had in common. All peoples comprise a single community, they said. All have God as common origin and goal. All religions grow from a deeply human desire to seek answers to the deepest mysteries of human life. What is man? What is the meaning and purpose of life? What is good? And what is sin? The language of this first article of the Declaration may sound to us now like familiar platitudes. But read in the context of history, this chapter presents a new self-understanding of the place of the church in the world, an agent of peace and reconciliation rather than a community whose relation to the world around it is a matter of correcting the world and defending its own truth, even as it attempts to share that truth. Does this mean that a former age of apologetics was entirely misguided? Not really. The history of church-world relations mirrors, on the group level, the developmental stages affirmed by the likes of Erickson and Fowler, who described a movement from the formation of individual identity in stages of increased participation in the surrounding society and world. Communities may also grow through such stages in their long histories. I recall growing up with the orientation that non-Catholics, not simply non-Christians, were a threat to my faith. And that the first thing about the others was that they are alien in some profound way. And the first thing about relating to those others is that I must be prepared to defend myself against them, not necessarily physically, but surely mentally and spiritually. This posture, I suspect, is a very human attitude and inherits socially from a long history. But a profound shift from that mentality was the attitude of Pope John, for whom the first step in any encounter with others was to establish what he had in common with them. And that step is based on a prior reality, the given unity of the human family. It takes a lot of growing up to get to that place. Chapter 2 of the document. The first paragraph of Chapter 2 attempts to generalize about the religious instinct that human beings have in common. To quote, "From ancient times down to the present, there has existed among diverse peoples a certain perception that hidden power which hovers over the course of things and over the events of human life. At times, indeed, recognition can be found of a supreme divinity, even a supreme Father, too. Such a perception and such a recognition instill the lives of these people with a profound religious sense. Religions bound up with cultural advancement have struggled to reply to these same questions with more refined concepts and more highly developed language." End of quote. Then comes a brief positive statement about beliefs in practices of particular religions: Hinduism, Buddhism, and third, the many various indigenous religions with their teaching, rules of life, sacred ceremonies. In the particulars of various religions, the Church acknowledges that these teachings and ways reflect a ray of the truth that enlightens all people. The penultimate paragraph of this section begins with a stunning sentence: "The Catholic Church rejects nothing which is true and holy in these religions." While this reflects a tradition that goes back to Justin Martyr in the 2nd century, who attributes all truths in non-Christian religions to the Word of God, who enlightens every person who comes into the world, nonetheless, Christian missionaries sometimes adopted the attitude that non-Christian religions were simply the work of Satan. And the missionary's task was to convert people from error to a knowledge of the truth. As Walter Abbott notes in his edition of the documents, this declaration marks an authoritative change in the approach. Now, for the first time, there is a recognition of other religions as entities with which the Church should enter into dialogue. The Church therefore urges her sons and daughters to enter with prudence and charity into dialogue and collaboration with the members of other religions. Let Christians, while witnessing to their own faith and way of life, acknowledge, preserve, and encourage the spiritual and moral truths found among non-Christians and also their social life and culture. Chapter 3. In an excursus, the whole thing, it's about a half page long. It's an excursus specifically on Muslims. This half-page chapter is devoted to affirming what Islam has in common with Christianity, and the first 5 sentences are still a revelation to many Christians. I'll read them. The Church also has high regard for the Muslims. They worship God, who is one, living, and subsistent, merciful, and almighty, the creator of heaven and earth, who has spoken to human beings. They strive to submit themselves without reserve to the hidden decrees of God, just as Abraham submitted himself to God's plan. To whose faith Muslims eagerly link their own. Although not acknowledging him as God, they venerate Jesus as a prophet, his Virgin Mother, whom they also honor, and also at times devoutly invoke. Further, they await the day of judgment and reward of God following the resurrection from the dead. For this reason, they highly esteem an upright life and worship God, especially by way of prayer, alms deeds, and fasting. Chapter 4, on the relationship between Christians and Jews. This section, of course, is where the rubber hits the road regarding the Catholic-Jewish relations. It should be read, however, not as a message to Jews, but as a position paper in which 2,300 council fathers clarify their own common understanding about the best way to think about and enact the relationship between the church and Jews. First comes a list of the scriptural ties that link Christians and Jews. And you can read that for yourself by just Googling the document. But they have to do with things that are commonly known and accepted, of course. These are Christians remaining Christians of are connected with Judaism. Things like the fact that, well, Jesus and the apostles were surely Jewish, and for that matter, all early Christians were Jewish. And we derive our sense of God from the tradition passed on to us, from the story of Israel's experience of God, and so forth. We're all familiar with that. The next paragraph acknowledges the historical fact that despite Christian origins in Judaism, Jews largely did not accept Jesus as the Messiah. Yet, given that God's covenant with Israel is never revoked, Paul teaches that clearly, and given that the Hebrew Scriptures themselves embody a vision that all people will one day worship the one God together, Jews have not been abandoned by God. Now notice the reference to ultimate union in worshiping the one God is described without reference to conversion. I'll move on here because I realize time is getting short. What follows now is a transitional sentence moving from what is held in common to what needs to be addressed regarding the errors of some Christians regarding the Jews in Judaism, what Jules Isaac called the teaching of contempt. And then we come to the place where they take up specifically some of those things were at the heart of... All right. To quote exactly, even though the Jewish authorities and those who followed their lead pressed for the death of Christ, neither all Jews indiscriminately at that time nor Jews today can be charged with crimes committed during the Passion. It is true that the church is the new people of God, yet Jews should not be spoken of as rejected or accursed, as if this followed from Holy Scripture. Consequently, all must take care lest in catechizing or in preaching the Word of God they teach anything which is not in accord with the truth of the gospel message or the Spirit of Christ. I will just cut quickly to a few final remarks. Can I snatch a few minutes here? Part 4 of my talk, not the document. You've heard my resume of the document. Why in this document is there no acknowledgement of guilt on the church's part? In his response to the document in the Walter Abbott edition of Vatican II papers, Claude Nelson refers to the response of a Rabbi David Polish, who found the declaration condescending and lacking in a spirit of reconciliation. He referred to it as, quote, a unilateral pronouncement by one party which presumes to redress on its own terms a wrong which it does not admit. I see his point. But I also think that the response misreads the nature of the document. Nostra Aetate is not really a text written directly to reconcile the church with Jews. Chapter 4 is indeed unilateral in that it's a result of an in-house discourse among 2,300 Catholic leaders coming to a common understanding of how the church needs to teach and act regarding its relationship to the Jews. As for the document as a whole, it represents an about-face of many maybe most, Christians in their relationship with people of non-Christian religions. The spirit in which it approaches other religions in conveying aspects of divine truth and the practice of respectful dialogue had not been typical in the practice of Christian life and mission. Understandably, Nostra Aetate records the church talking to itself, but talk that was necessary, was absolutely necessary and decidedly a movement forward. In this document, the church talking to itself allows itself to be overheard. At least that's my reading of what's going on here. And it should be accepted for the forward movement it was, even though it doesn't satisfy what we would like them to have said. I actually have 2 pages more, but I do want to honor the time limit, and I thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dennis, and thank you, Eileen and others, for inviting me. Just as we were beginning, I overheard Dennis say, there are so many of my colleagues, friends, and students here today, and I think that almost anywhere Dennis goes, he will find those groups of people. It really has been and will continue to be a pleasure to work with Dennis and other colleagues at Creighton over the years. I am honored to have been asked to participate in this commemoration, and I think it's fair to say, celebration of Nostra Aetate. As my esteemed colleague Dennis Hamm has eloquently pointed out, there is much to celebrate in a document that has fruitfully steered Christian-Jewish relations for a half a century thus far. My response is intended to be no more or no less than what I hope is a thoughtful reflection by one Jew, namely myself. It is important as we move forward this afternoon to keep in mind that no one, it's almost superfluous to mention, including Benjamin Netanyahu, should presume to speak for or on behalf of the entire Jewish community. What unites Jews should never be underestimated. At the same time, Jews differ on any number of issues relating to belief, practice, and identity. I mentioned this early on because as I continue, I will refer to the cooperation that existed and continues to exist between some Jewish leaders and some Catholic leaders. The splits or differences of opinion that occur among high-ranking church officials, especially at the Vatican, this I leave to others to ponder, as Dennis has led us to do. I am considerably more knowledgeable with respect to distinctive features of different portions of the Jewish community. Since these differing features do have a direct impact on the relative value placed on Jewish-Christian relations by leading Jewish leaders, this becomes relevant as we proceed. Speaking of leaders and of followers necessarily means a consideration of individuals. Among the many features of Dennis's presentation that I appreciated was the personal, that is, individual way in which he began. Eloquently, and at least for me, memorably, he reminds us that our personal circumstances, while shaped by any number of events far and wide, are just that, personal to us. And the impact of the personal circumstances, especially during the years in which we are growing up, this impact is enormous. Let me illustrate this with 2 apt anecdotes, alas, neither of which is particularly revealing about me. The first one contrasts something about myself with an individual whom we all know well, namely Amy Jo Levine. It happens that Dennis and I, along with our then colleague Brian LeBeau, were responsible for AJ's first invitation and appearance to Omaha, which I'm thinking was in 1998. which was about the third year I was here. In one of her books, The Misunderstood Jew, which is one of A.J.'s most popular and justifiably widely read books, she begins this way: "When I was a child, my ambition was to be Pope." That's the very first words of the text. Only A.J. would begin a book that way, and I mean that with admiration. She continues, "I was raised in North Dartmouth, Massachusetts, a suburb of New Bedford, in a neighborhood that was predominantly Roman Catholic and Portuguese. Thus, my introduction to the church was through ethnic Catholicism, and it was marvelous. Feast days and festivals, pageantry and mystery, food and more food. When I was 7, this early fascination with Christianity came to a head with 2 events. First, I became insistent upon making my first communion. Second, that year, a friend on the school bus said to me, 'You killed our Lord.' 'I did not,' I responded with some indignation. 'Yes, you did,' the girl insisted. 'Our priest said so.' My recollection of growing up in Richmond, Virginia, some years before A.J. was growing up in Massachusetts, was that there was a Baptist or Methodist church on nearly every corner. I went to a Southern Baptist university for my undergraduate education, and the president of the university called me a fine Christian gentleman. I saw nothing incongruous about this, and apparently neither did he. To my knowledge and recollection, no one has ever called me a name because of my religion or made any accusation based on my being Jewish. I may be uniquely fortunate in this regard, or I may have a poor memory, but hopefully this is a winning streak that will not end. In the second anecdote, I was attending the first statewide Holocaust observance in Columbia, South Carolina, when I was teaching at the University of South Carolina. And one of the people I was talking with was an African-American education leader in South Carolina who I had known from several different other events. We had a chance to talk, and he told me that he grew up in Union, South Carolina, which is a city in the upstate, or town in the upstate of perhaps 25 or 30,000. And that when he was growing up, there were about a half a dozen dry goods stores. These are the predecessors of the department stores, locally owned stores. And of those half dozen or so dry goods stores, 2 were owned by Jewish families. And of those half dozen or so dry goods stores, there were 2 where he, as an African American, and his family as African Americans, were welcomed and treated with great respect. Those were the 2 stores that were owned by Jews. It would be great to say that all Jewish merchants, or all Jews in general, have been without prejudice, racial or otherwise, throughout the history of the world. Of course, that's not true. But for this man who was well-educated, those stories were pivotal and remain pivotal, and I'm so thankful that the 2 store owners were as welcoming as I hope that I would have been under the circumstances. Finally, there is something that I find perfectly natural as a Jew, but that my students at Creighton, and others as well, might seem to find difficult to understand. As a minority, albeit a pretty talented and active minority, we Jews are always counting. How many Jews have won the Nobel Prize, Pulitzer Prize, Academy Awards? How many Jews are members of Congress? How many Jews serve on the Supreme Court? And we know these things. And so, let me admit right away, I was not tempted to go off to the basketball tournament today. Well, it would have been strange because I was here, but I'm not a big sports fan. And I didn't really look forward to the Super Bowl or not look forward to it. And I actually didn't know who won after the Super Bowl was over. And the next day, almost every day I read online the Forward, which is a national Jewish newspaper, and the Jerusalem Post English edition, which is an Israeli newspaper. And what did I find about the Super Bowl the day after it was over on Monday? 2 things were important: Adina Menzel and Julian Edelman. Whoa. Adina Menzel as you probably know, is a well-known singer, a Broadway performer, who came, I think she probably rose to national prominence when John Travolta mispronounced her name at the Academy Awards in 2014, and very creepily tried to make up for it this year. Idina Menzel, you may or may not know, is Jewish. And she did the national anthem. I don't know if you remember the national anthem. I actually YouTubed the national anthem to hear her perform it. It was an incredible presentation. And two things I observed. One was I had heard that somewhere on New Year's Eve, she had missed a note. And you know what that means on the internet: scandal, scandal, scandal. The other thing I observed was that as they did close-ups of some of the football players, obviously they weren't going to tear up, but they looked pretty close to it. This was an impressive event. Number one for the Jews. Number two is more ambiguous. The question that we were asking was whether Julian Edelman, a player for the Patriots, was Jewish or not. I have to tell you that having read all that I could, I don't know. But it is therefore not surprising for me as an individual Jew to ask some variant of that query with respect to Nostra Aetate. Has it been good for the Jews? In affirming, oh, yes, I almost forgot. When Francis became Pope, this was front page news on all of the Jewish publications. And what was the headline? Is the Pope good for the Jews? As if the Pope has nothing else to do but this. This is a Jewish characteristic that I happen to find very nice. Therefore, it was not surprising for me to ask a question like, is Nostra Aetate good for the Jews? Has it been good for the Jews? In formulating a response, I've come up with an alliterative title, and I love alliteration. Nostra Aetate and the Jews, yorn, yarn, or yarn. Whew. Okay, or in other words, should I think of Nostra Aetate as essentially an intra-Roman Catholic document, in which case it's yorn, which is a variant of yours? Or should I understand that it was intended to have some relevance to me, but it really doesn't, in which case it's a yarn? Doesn't matter. Or that it is like a thread with which we can weave any number of interconnected, if metaphorical, garments, that is, yarn. The very history of the formulation of Nostra Aetate, upon which Dennis touched so well, renders it inappropriate to speak of the document as entirely the church's in origin or in spirit. There were many Jews, and here I speak of practicing Jews, and not Jews who had converted to Christianity. There were many Jews who played formative roles in the serious soul-searching that preceded the formal composition and various stages of recomposition of the document. And Jews were consulted at all stages in the process. I will return to this, but observe here that it won't do, at least for me, to disassociate myself or my religion from Nostra Aetate. While I don't need any statement from the church, or for that matter from a synagogue, to define who I am in terms of my Judaism, it does matter to me very deeply how our traditions and practices are perceived by others, especially when they take pains to invite us to be part of the process. So it's a no-go for this to be yorn, that is, that we have no stake in it, we have no role, we have no opinion. In that manner, I don't think it's productive to respond as a Jew to Nostra Aetate with silence or with something that approximates disdain. It represents something heroic. Yes, the church and the synagogues also sometimes produce heroes, especially so, as Dennis pointed out so well, when I familiarize myself with the bureaucratic, ideological, and political impediments that were thrown up against this statement, which, in denying corporate and eternal Jewish responsibility for the death of Jesus, simply reiterates what I've always been taught and what I think the New Testament has always taught. The process takes time and an enormous expenditure of theological energy and political savvy. Even as I wish for more in some parts of Nostra Aetate that relates to Jews and less in some other parts, these are matters which deserve discussion, open agreement, equally open disagreement among Jews and between Jews and Christians. Simply put, this is not something that I should yawn over. Thus, I am left with the not at all unpromising task of considering how we might most profitably weave together our traditions in a positive and respectful way. That is, the image of the yarn. In order to do so, let me call attention to a few specific points. Nostra Aetate would not be Nostra Aetate without the active and willing input offered by certain Jewish leaders, preeminent among whom, as an individual, was Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, and institutionally, the American Jewish Congress. On this, the record is clear. It's unequivocal. Progressive Catholic leaders asked for help. Progressive Jewish leaders answered. Along with this, I acknowledge and respect Jews for whom such dialogue is not a priority. In general, and not without good reason, Rabbi Heschel is one of the heroes of the story. In the world at large, he is by far the best-known Jewish leader of his generation. But at the same time, and from roughly the same background, there was another major leader of American Jewry, Rabbi Joseph B. Soloveitchik. Within Judaism, he helped traditional orthodoxy creatively cope with modernity, such that segments of mainstream Orthodox Judaism are among the most vibrant to this day. When it came to dealing with non-Jews, especially on doctrinal matters or matters of faith, Rabbi Soloveitchik counseled extreme caution, which he himself exemplified. This doesn't make him a villain, in my view, nor are his followers in the Orthodox community today to be berated because they don't join in interfaith enterprises. Thus, when Jews read or read about Nostra Aetate, it is not as if they were eavesdropping on a conversation that doesn't involve or include them. This is historically inaccurate. But it is also the case, as Dennis pointed out, that Nostra Aetate is addressed to Catholics and offers them guidance in terms of belief and practice. It was never its intention, nor should it have been, to fulfill a similar role within Judaism. That said, most Jews are, in my view, not well informed. I had some other terms, but I'll just say not well informed. Most Jews are not well informed about Christianity in general and Roman Catholicism in particular. In order to overcome this lack of knowledge and the biases it breeds, I have tried to develop opportunities within the local Jewish community to educate people about Christianity. As we all know, the beliefs and practices of contemporary Judaism are not identical to the beliefs and practices of ancient Israel. Similarly, no discerning individual would equate Christianity of today with the religion of Jesus' time. By and large, my efforts here, like efforts of colleagues elsewhere, have not met with much success. In general, I am told that Jews don't yet know enough about Judaism, so why should we as a community be teaching Jews about Christianity? Moreover, historically, discussions of Christianity have been forced on Jews, not in an effort to educate, but for the sole purpose of conversion. Times have changed. What it means to be an informed American and an informed Jew has also changed. In a sense, all of this, of which Nostra Aetate is a cause and a result, presents an extraordinarily rich and unique opportunity. As I just mentioned, for most of the time when Judaism and Christianity have coexisted as religions, relations have been contentious and one-sided. In Europe, Christians held the power, and Jews were viewed as outsiders. Conversion or death were seen as the only remedies for their false beliefs. Any appreciation of Jews and Judaism on their own terms was banished. This has changed. In many ways, alas, it took the slaughter of 6 million Jews and 14 million other non-combatants to bring this about. After the war, as Jews, or at least some of them, and Christians, or at least some of them, came together, it was like a homecoming of long-separated siblings, 40s and 50s into the 60s. In these joyous and fruitful circumstances, features held in common were celebrated. But we know deep down that while Jews and Christians share many beliefs and values, they do not operate in interchangeable systems, and they do not agree on everything. Some of these disagreements are peripheral, others are central. We are now, or we should be now, at a point where we can give due emphasis to the features we hold in common while not ignoring or papering over our disagreements. Respect is what we as Jews offer. Respect is what we Jews expect. Any sense, whether intended or not, that dialogue is seen as a step toward our conversion away from Judaism poisons the positive relations we seek to establish. For many, Nostra Aetate was not as clear on this as desired. In Dennis's understanding, such concerns do not spring from a fair reading of the text itself. On this point, I'm not fully convinced. But I am convinced that there are still places for people of goodwill to come together, and that Nostra Aetate has defined and continues to promote one of these places. It is a step, but only that in the right direction. And yet it is worth observing we will only get there step by step. Since I mentioned AJ in the last paragraph, as I did earlier on, I should point out that she will be back again, yes, in this very auditorium, Tuesday at 7 o'clock, in a series of lectures. It's part of a series of lectures on religion and women, and she will be speaking about Adam and Eve, and it is obviously open to the public. In one of her writings, as I recall, A.J. likens Judaism and Christianity to two parallel tracks on which trains follow somewhat divergent paths, but end up in the same place. That place I cannot define or describe. Nonetheless, when I reach it, I fully expect to be welcomed by many of those joined together here today. Or if it turns out that I get there first, I'll be welcoming you. Thank you very much.